Right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is the fourth meeting of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee in 2014. First item of business is for the committee to decide whether its consideration in the next steps of its inquiry into procedures for considering legislation, its work programme and provision of services to cross-party groups, and a draft report on the Scotland Act 2012 finance changes should be taken in private at future meetings. Do members agree to take these items in private? Agreed. Yes, I've just been reminded that we do have apologies from Fiona MacLeod, who's not well this morning. It was a relatively late call-off, so we're slightly uncertain as to whether Colin Keir, substitute, will be with us today. Hopefully he shall be. We shall see. Agenda item 2 is for the committee to take evidence into the inquiry into lobbying. I'd like to mention our panel of one this morning. Stuart Allen, Commissioner for Ethical Standards in Public Life in Scotland. We may wish to note that Mr Allen will shortly be liberated from the duties which currently sit on his shoulders, I think, in approximately a week's time. So we're particularly grateful as he comes to the end of his time that he's before us today. Welcome. Right. Let's just go. Our process, we will go straight to questions, and at the very end, if you think, Mr Allen, there are issues we haven't otherwise covered that you think it would be useful for us to hear your comments on, and of course we have your briefing paper, then I'll invite you to do that at the end of the session. Right. Let me start with Cara Hilton.
Hi, good morning. To what extent do you think reform is required, and do you think that greater openness will lead to greater confidence in the political process?
First of all, Convener, thank you very much for these warm words of welcome. Much appreciated indeed. Is reform required? Lobbying is a legitimate and desirable part of the democratic process, and we start there and we finish there. Anyone, any individual or organisation can lobby his or her elected members, parliamentary level, government level, and indeed government officials. In my period in office, as I've indicated in my submission, in the last 6 years, there have only been 2 complaints on lobbying, and these complaints were dismissed. So I have detected no significant problem in the field of lobbying. We have a code of conduct that covers lobbying of MSPs. It covers gifts. It covers paid advocacy, and that's further dealt with in the Interests of Members Act. And from a lobbyist point of view, we have the Bribery Act of 2010, which consolidated a lot of the earlier Scottish legislation on the matter. So I have really come to the general conclusion that the whole framework is fit for purpose and robust. More importantly, I have seen no evidence of the need for a Scottish bill. And I've read with some care and attention the evidence provided, but I have failed to detect any evidence as I would understand the term. We're aware, of course, openness is terribly important. It's a key principle for the Scottish Parliament, and the Scottish Parliament has been ready to embrace that. But whether increasing openness by requiring registration of lobbyists would increase confidence in the political process. That's a big jump, and I'm not convinced of the link. At the end of the day, if you introduce a regulatory regime, let me just call it that, then any benefits that might come out of that have to be balanced against the fact that you are imposing restrictions and regulation on people. How many people we can talk about later. That will bring its own inhibitions on people. And I think you have to bear in mind, or assess rather, to what extent will this inhibit people in exercising their democratic rights in coming forward and lobbying their MSPs and other representatives. That is the test that has to be applied. Now, I'm aware of the Transparency Act, which applies in England, which is a very complex piece of legislation, but also equally restricted. It applies to business lobbyists. There's an exclusion for VAT and so on. But perhaps it's interesting to note that in Wales they've carried out a similar exercise to what you've done, and they concluded, largely on the basis of there being no evidence that there was an issue, to adopt what they have called the Welsh approach to the matter. I appreciate that the committee is well down the road to thinking about a bill, but I can only give you the benefit of my own experience on the matter and my own consideration of the issues as they're currently displayed, and having regard to the real evidence that exists at the time of speaking. So I do have these reservations as to whether statutory reform is required.
Just as a follow-up from that, I mean, in principle, do you think responsibility for ensuring transparency should lie with those being lobbied, the lobbyists, or both?
I think essentially both. And to some extent, this depends on whom the lobbyists are seeking to lobby. So that, for example, if they are seeking to lobby MSPs, then the code of conduct that you have, I think, is quite robust. I may have one or two comments later on. I don't want to get into that now at the moment. You've got the Bribery Act. You are effectively covering all the areas where there might be regarded as undue influence or improper influence. And it's up to the MSP to apply the code of conduct. Now, I said a moment ago, I have no complaints about MSPs. I have no evidence whatsoever that MSPs are failing to apply the code of conduct on lobbying. If someone has examples, let me hear them. But in all the submissions that you had, Convener, I didn't detect any hard evidence. And I'm quite satisfied that MSPs are properly applying the lobbying rules in the code. Now, the lobbying can, of course, apply to other people, such as government ministers and to civil servants. And again, I think the responsibility there for identifying what lobbying is taking place is really best placed with the ministers and the civil servants. Now, I cannot tell you to what extent that information is being publicly made available, but there will undoubtedly be records kept of the meetings with lobbyists by ministers and civil servants. So there is a responsibility there on the ministers and civil servants to play their part. Lobbyists, I think, at the present time, have responsibility so far as they are members of the two main organisations that deal with lobbying in Scotland. The great difficulty in saying, well, lobbyists should do this and lobbyists should do that, will come down to the definition of who is a lobbyist.
I wonder if I can just play some of that back to you and test what I think I'm hearing. Is at the core of where you're coming from that if we get this wrong as a parliament and make it more difficult to lobby, then the lobbyists who are most likely to retire from lobbying are those least well-funded and with least capability, and perhaps those who most represent the public interest, while those who represent commercial and business interests would be less affected by a regime of greater control, and therefore it would actually tilt the balance in a direction which is quite different from the one I suspect we might wish to go. Is that essentially what you're saying? Beware of putting too many constraints, otherwise you'll reduce good lobbying.
Yes, yes. Who's to say what's good lobbying and who's to say what's bad lobbying? It's lobbying that's important. It's an essential part of the democratic process. In fact, if anything, more and more lobbying should be encouraged. And it's up to MSPs, it's up to ministers, it's up to civil servants to take whatever they think is appropriate into account and to disregard other representations. But the mere fact of lobbying is a fundamental democratic part of the democratic process, and we should be very, very reluctant before we're thinking about imposing restrictions on the people of the country before they're allowed to lobby. And particularly when there is no evidence that there is an issue.
Right. So we mustn't make it difficult to lobby. Cameron, I'll invite you, Cameron, to follow up on that, but then proceed to the questions you're going to ask.
Well, it's part of... sorry, good morning, Commissioner. It's part of my questions anyway. Do you think it's going to drive the good lobbyists or the more amateur lobbyists underground a bit, the ones who haven't got well enough funded? I mean, that's what you seem to be saying. It'll only be the ones who can lobby in public, who've got lots of public funds, but otherwise they're going to, the ones who are small and are going to say, to heck with it, aren't they?
I wasn't quite at that stage yet. I may come on to that if I may. But the point I'm saying, who is a lobbyist? Who is a lobbyist? A lobbyist is anybody. An individual, a company perhaps with a vested interest, a public body. They can be lobbyists. They can lobby in respect of their own sphere of operation. Political parties. Are they lobbyists? Are you get? I'm sure you get lobbied by.
Yes, I think they are lobbyists, frankly.
Community groups, advocacy groups, and finally, but by no means least, your ordinary constituent. Your constituent comes along to your meeting on Saturday morning in the Echel-Fechner Dounreay Village Church and says, I want to press this point, I think we need change here. That's what democracy is all about. If you start to put restrictions on that, I think you do it, you know, with some peril. And so I'm not immediately drawing a clear-cut distinction that, oh, there is a readily identified category as professional lobbyists, which people seem to be more concerned with, and the ordinary man in the street. Everyone is potentially a lobbyist. And if you look at it from that point of view, you then begin to see the difficulty in creating a statutory framework to regulate that without creating an awful lot of complex law.
Therefore, if you have a lobbying register, it won't have greater openness. It'll be you're going to make it more closed. Are you? You're going to make it more of a closed shop. You think people are just going to keep away from it?
I think that's the grave danger. It depends on how you how you design the register. And as I say, I'm not advocating that. But if you were to design the register very tightly, how many people would have statutory duties imposed on them to record information, to write this down, write that down? Every time you do that, you have somebody who fails to do it. There is then a problem, and that becomes the problem. Not the openness, the fact that someone has failed in their obligations to comply with paragraph 22(3)(b) of the register.
Excuse me, you said you had 2 complaints in the last few years, both of which were rejected.
Yes.
Were they? I mean, can you sort of explain a bit more about them without breaching any confidentiality as to why were they rejected, or at least why were they rejected? Because they didn't come within the competence of your office, or
yes,
what?
Because of statutory restrictions, I can't explain in detail, but they were nowhere near being a substantive complaint, if I can put it that way. Nowhere near being a real complaint.
Thank you, Convener.
Would you be able to say what prompted the complaints? In other words, was it, as sometimes we are guilty of as politicians, they were politically motivated for effect? Was that perhaps where they were coming from?
Convener, I wonder if I could just simply send you a letter about the complaints and that,
if you were,
to put it...
yes, if you were to do so, that would be part of the public record, of course.
Yes, yes, yes.
Right.
I'll write it in such a way that you want it on the public record. I'll write it in those terms then.
Right,
yes.
that would be likely to be helpful.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Can I just pick up on the back of what Cameron has been saying and just say that you would caution us to beware of imposing duties on the lobbyist, but you might direct us to consider lobbying. In other words, what is done rather than who does it.
I think as far as the lobbyists are concerned, Convener, what I'm really saying is you've got to be very careful if you're going to say lobbyists, we're only going to deal with the following lobbyists, say commercial lobbyists, because that raises issues itself. What about the other bodies who are equally influential or seeking to influence MSPs, that have a particular link with MSPs? You know, big companies, big institutions, local government, public bodies, political parties. I haven't heard much of them in the debate, but they are very influential. Your community groups, do you exclude all those and just deal with commercial lobbyists? And if so, why? I think that's the point about that. The activity itself, I've said, is a key part of the democratic process. And any restriction on that, you've got to give very, very serious consideration to.
Richard Lyle?
Morning, Mr. Lamb.
Good morning.
I think I have to say that having known the Standards Commission over the last number of years, previously as a councillor, most of the complaints you received were councillors about councillors. I look forward to seeing the 2 complaints when you send the paperwork in. And I've listened intently to your comments, and can I actually say that the committee, to my mind, is looking at whether we haven't made up our mind yet, and whether the government wants to do it or not is up to them, but we haven't made up our mind. Last night I attended 3 events in this Parliament. I spoke to various people. would you class that as being lobbied? And the point, as you've made, and the question that really I should be asking you is, do you think because of the Parliament's founding principles of accessibility, openness, accountability and the sharing of power that we really do need a register?
I think that the code at present says you should consider keeping a record of contacts with lobbyists. Now, that seems to have worked pretty well, but for accuracy, it's paragraph 5.1.5 of the code. Members should consider keeping a record of all contacts with lobbyists. There's a problem there in that it says consider, so it's not worth the paper it's written on in some ways, you could say. But there might be a way of looking further at that and saying, should MSPs be recording meetings with lobbyists when they are making representations? When they are making representations. And the code could be amended to say members should keep a record of all contacts with lobbyists when they are making representations to that MSP. So you've got to keep the record. There's got to be an understanding that representations are being made. So the informal social function or the informal information gathering function would not be caught. I accept that the test, who's going to make the test about whether representations are being made? And, all right, you can have an objective assessment. But at the end of the day, I think the responsibility is primarily that. Now, at the present time, and you will be able to tell me better than not whether you do keep records of contacts with lobbyists, but if there is a requirement, that raises the duties on MSPs that little bit extra. So if you are seeing someone from, say, a commercial lobbyist company and you meet them in the street, you don't have to record that. But if you meet them to discuss something, then the phrasing I've talked about would mean that you should record that. The second issue, then, is whether that record has to be made public. But more importantly, or equally importantly, I should say, you've got to raise the question, all right, if we can do that for MSPs, what do we do with ministers? What do we do with civil servants? Do we require them to keep records on lobbying? My own understanding is that ministers will keep records of when they're being lobbied in a formal way, and that civil servants will as well. But we come back to the second question is, should any of that be made public? And I don't have a ready answer to give to you. I think you can get to a stage when you are intruding far too much into the ordinary business activities of MSPs, to whom I give a lot of credence, and I think they're doing a good job. Ministers and civil servants, are you intruding by requiring them to print all that? Because every time you put in a requirement saying you've got to publish this record, there'll be a dozen exemptions. There'll be a dozen exemptions. So where is it getting you? But I come back to the point, if you want to move to widen the goalposts a little bit, you could do it comparatively easily by looking at the possibility of keeping a record mandatory rather than discretionary.
It's been my understanding, and it's happened, if I asked to meet with the Minister would wait until his member of staff come into the room before he even started the discussion with me, unless we were just talking about the weather. And basically, if in recording, our members of staff record their diaries, put in what meetings we have to go to, what diaries, what people who want to meet as constituents or companies, so that we do have a record. In fact, I'll not show it on camera, but on your phone, it comes up. My phone tells me 15 minutes before that I've got to meet so-and-so at such and such a time. Do you really think it will get to a point, and I will come back in later on this, it get to a point that we'll get overburdened with recording this and recording that? As I say, last night, the three events I went to last night when I spoke to people, should I begin back to record that I spoke to? One of the events was chemical companies. Should I be going back to say I spoke to Joe Bloggs and Jimmy Soap from such and such a chemical company?
My answer is yes. Okay. I think you're asking far too much, and it's completely disproportionate. That's my own view. Another commissioner might have a different view, but I think you're requiring far too much. Every time you require something, somebody will forget to do something. Then, you mentioned it's all councillor against councillor. And a political opponent will say, well, you didn't register that you saw so-and-so. That then becomes the issue. It's the complaint that's the issue. It's not the openness about meeting and discussing something that may be of critical importance to your community, whether we're going to build a new hall or something like that. It's the complaint that's the issue. So I would canny on requiring too much in any register.
Thank you, Convener.
Can I just draw from what you've just been saying there? When the government makes significant decisions, in general terms, there's an equality assessment associated with them. There may be likely to be an environmental impact assessment. Should there be an assessment of influence as well that's published as part of that process? I'm not, in asking the question, presupposing the answer.
The consultation is big business these days, very thorough. People that make representations tend to have those representations recorded in the consultation exercise at the end of the day. So if individuals or community groups have made their views known, they will be recorded on an appendix in the assessment of the consultation exercise. I would have thought that is working well, and I don't see any particular reason to ask for more to be done.
Can I just cross-check? One of the things that is permitted is that consultees can ask that their identity not be disclosed.
Yes.
And you can see why that might be the case, where private interests are involved and relationships could be damaged.
Yes, yes.
How do you think we should look at that?
Well, I think that also brings you into questions of commercial confidentiality and so on, which is difficult to deal with briefly. But it's comparatively easy to have a formula whereby you require the MSP or the lobbyist to say that they saw so-and-so to talk about X, full stop, on such and such a date. And that probably won't breach any element of confidentiality. But you do wonder, what is that achieving? Is it achieving much? Well, if someone doesn't fill that in, as I come back to an earlier point I made, that's the problem. Oh, you didn't mention that you'd seen Jeannie McGuigan on the 3rd of June. And you're now too late to do it, so that's a breach of the lobbying registration code. That'll be in the paper. And, you know, to some extent, all the good works that are going on are getting underdone by an issue of confidence or trust in the Parliament, which is totally unfounded, really.
Margaret?
It's really just around this question of trust. I think that we're looking at this because it's around openness and accountability. I mean, in your submission, your written submission, you spoke about a voluntary register. So why should the register not be compulsory and not apply to all lobbying activity? I mean, you have spoken a little about that this morning already, but just the voluntary side, and why would that be?
Yes, yes. I think there are very significant concerns about creating a statutory register with everything that flows from that, the definition of who's a lobbyist, the definition of what is lobbying, and what information is recorded and how it's reported back. It's quite a complicated parcel of provisions that you've got. The thing about the voluntary one is there is a voluntary scheme at the moment for the two major lobbying organisations. Now, I do not know how successful they are in ensuring compliance and so on, but it seems to me, in the absence of any evidence that there is a problem, to test whether, in fact, that can perhaps be given a greater status. But I'm not pressing that particularly hard. My own position is that I don't think there is a made-out case for statutory provisions in this area.
And the voluntary side would be just left to the individual MSP or to the lobbyist?
Well, I personally feel that if you're going to press me on it, I personally feel that the Parliament could bring in the lobbying associations, and along with the expertise that this committee and the clerks have, they could come up with a code of conduct for lobbyists. And that way you could set about coming to a definition of lobbyists. Who do you want to include? You can include that, and that would be embodied in a voluntary code that everyone could adopt. You would give your stamp to that on a voluntary basis. I think that would bring a great deal of credibility to it, but it would give you the flexibility of learning where things are going wrong. And I think that there is something to be said there. You've got people with a lot of expertise. Your own clerks are dealing with the cross-party groups and so on. They're dealing with registration of your own interests. They're dealing with declaration of interests. I'm not going to look across at them in case they're looking askance at me, saying, but there's a lot of here. And if the Parliament were to take some lead and say, look, we feel that there should be a code of conduct that everyone in Scotland can sign up to, and would like to apply it on a voluntary basis, I'm sure you could do that. I'm sure you could do that.
Sure, Mr. Allen, when you praise our clerks to the rafters, there is little resistance from this end of the table.
Indeed,
So, if we could if there was to be a register, what information should be on that register?
Well, that largely depends on the Parliament, what it wants to be included. You can have a large amount of information, a medium amount of information, a low one. If you want a very light touch organisation, then you have limited requirements of what has to be registered. You maybe just limit it to professional lobbyists. You won't catch many that way, I wouldn't have thought, in Scotland. But you could do that. But it's a matter for you, I think, to decide. But at the end of the day, the test probably should be, when you're thinking about this, is what does the public need to know? That should be the test. What does it need to know? And I think only you can take a view on whether you need very comprehensive, detailed amount of information, a modest amount, or a very, very limited amount of information. Now, obviously, the more you require, the more complex it becomes. It may well be draconian. And if you then have a very light touch regime and you require limited information, then the argument is it's not effective. It's not covering anything. It's not achieving anything. So you've got regulation with no end in sight. So I'm sorry I can't be more helpful here, but
We've heard from other panels that there are lobbying registers in other countries,
Yes.
and they work well. So, you know, so
well,
why don't we have one?
Well, whether they work well or not, I'm not in a position to say. I mean, you do have various regimes. You've got the new United Kingdom regime, which was set up for a particular purpose because there were particular issues there that were on BBC News all the time. There was an identified problem. But then it's limited to the people who are in the business of commercial lobbying, people who are not registered for VAT are excluded, and so on. It has to be done for gain. So it's really quite narrow. Once you meet that test, there's quite a lot of stuff that has to be covered. But a lot of people that I would regard as bona fide lobbyists are not included in that definition. Then you can go across to I think the Canadian model, which a lot of people are attracted to, saying that largely people that are commercial lobbyists are caught, but only if they spend more than 20% of their time doing lobbying and so on. Now, just take that as an example. Say you're in a comparatively small charity and you've maybe got a campaign going. Somebody in the office may well be doing 25–40% of the work on that for a period of time. They've got to then start filling in all this material. They've probably got to pay a fee. Now, somebody's got to spend the time doing that. And unless there is a measurable gain from doing that, I think you've really got to think long and hard about what requirements you impose.
If we can just imagine there was to be a register, who do you think should administer that register?
Well,
and you just mentioned
I thought you
well.
would come to that, actually, convener. If you have a voluntary type approach to the issue for a year or two, as I'm very loosely advocating, and I think Parliament and the clerks should be taking the lead there. If you're wanting people to register as lobbyists, if you are, then I think that is sufficient. If you're wanting a more extensive framework, then you are then really saying you want somebody independent to do that. And I would accept my own office or the office of the Standards Commission would be an appropriate office to deal with that. But I'm not advocating that. So, but I think just looking at it objectively, that would. And perhaps since we are on the point, I think there are issues about resources here. You cannot run a register like that. The more you you ease the definition of lobbyists to make it as wide as possible, the bigger the register will be. The paperwork involved means staff time, either in my own office, Standards Commission, clerks, and none of that, of course, has been quantified, either for high, medium or low
so,
registration.
you know, could that perhaps be covered by a registration fee? Do you think there should be a fee, or would that be prohibitive?
Well, I think I'm going to avoid giving you a clear-cut answer on this, because I have reservations that the scheme has not been costed yet. I mean, are you having high regulation, medium regulation, low regulation? All of these can presumably be costed to some extent. And only then can you really take a view on whether a fee is required. I must admit, personally, and I do emphasise, I am instinctively not keen on a fee regime, largely because if you have the smaller organisations, community groups, and charities, small charities, they've got to find a fee on top of everything else. I'm not very keen on that at all. Sure, a big organisation, it would be nothing to them. But I think you've got to go back to the very first point. Lobbying is a legitimate activity. Are you taxing democracy?
And I suppose the other thing, if we did have this register, who would then monitor it, and what sanctions should there be?
Well, I would imagine that whoever is in charge of the register and so on, if it's voluntary, the clerks would do that. If my office is doing the register, we would monitor it as well. I would imagine that was the most straightforward approach to it. Sanctions, I would really ask you to think long and hard about that. Because I come back to the principle, lobbying is a legitimate democratic pursuit. You start imposing sanctions, what, because someone has failed to register in time? That's what it'll amount to. They start getting sanctions. Now, people will start drawing comparisons with councillors who've been sanctioned or MSPs who've been sanctioned and so on. They'll say, what, you're sanctioning somebody for being late in putting in a return? You know, where is the public trust and confidence going to come for that type of approach? I suspect although your first reaction is, well, there's got to be some sanction. Probably does. But all I'm saying is you've got to be very wary about how you design that sanction.
Right, thank you, Mr. Allen.
George, have you?
Yes, good morning, thank you, Convener. Good morning, Mr. Allen. Could I, Professor Susan Deakin was at the last committee meeting. She had a unique perspective on it because she's looking at it from former MSP and looking from the outside in as well, and from a commercial point of view as well. And she said that might be a way forward if we look at some of the practices and processes that we have already within the Parliament and maybe adapt and change them. Would you think that would possibly be something we could look at as well?
I think that's preferable to a wholesale framework being designed up for the purpose. I think there are some things like, I mean, I've already mentioned that the Code of Conduct for MSPs, you could perhaps crank up the requirements to record and so on. Equally, you could perhaps ask the government to look at what is said in the ministerial code about recording lobbying that goes on, and you could agree to look at the Civil Service Code to see to what extent that could be tightened up. I think these are all well worth considering.
Okay, just on the other aspect, if there was a register, and I know you have some concerns with it because my question is going to go down some of your concerns as well, is the fact that what thresholds for registration, what exemptions do you think there should be for it? You know, and I know you've already kind of hinted at that's where the difficulty is, but how would you believe we should go forward if there was a register like that?
I think, coming back to the earlier question, I think you're probably, if you're going to have a register, you've got to think hard about how you design that and whether you're having a high amount of regulation, medium or low, and you've got to design it to suit what you think is the right level. At one end, you could say it'll only be commercial lobbyists that are lobbying for gain, etc. You won't catch many people that way, I wouldn't have thought. And that then leaves the question, well, what is this? Where's the added value to all this if it's only commercial lobbyists, where I'm sure MSPs, I'm sure ministers know fine where commercial lobbyists are coming from. And I just find it very difficult to see that the whole concept of more regulation.
I think you give a point with the value
Yeah.
perspective of it, because I mentioned on a number of occasions that what's the grey bit in the middle?
Yeah.
It's not black and white. When does it become a major employer in your constituency wanting to lobby you professionally, but they've got so many jobs that they're actually supporting your constituency? It's a constituency issue in itself.
Yes.
You know, where does it become? That becomes very grey at that stage, in my opinion, anyway. You know.
Well, I agree entirely with that. I mean, you've got a big employer who's maybe going through a hard time. Maybe there's competition in Europe. There are issues that have developed that they want to lobby you and your colleague MSPs. They want to lobby ministers. They maybe want to lobby civil servants. Why should they suddenly have to register for 2 or 3 months of lobbying? It will be an issue. It will be in the newspapers. It will be known that they're doing all that. In the middle of a hard time, why should there be a prohibition on lobbying until they have registered? Now, the nature of businesses going under is that action needs to be taken immediately. And that's probably a very good example when the fact that you've got regulations requiring registration would actually impede your ability to do your job properly on behalf of your constituents and companies in your constituency.
Can I also ask, you mentioned about other countries, and I wondered if you'd had a chance to talk to people who are in a similar role to you. And basically we've heard that if someone's pro the idea of having registration, Canada seems to be the area that they always put up. Depending on who you're talking to from the witnesses, some say the US system's not bad, some say it's a mess, and some say that the UK system, Westminster, just a box-ticking exercise. You know, have you been able to talk to any other people in your role with regards to this?
No, I'm aware of the broad terms of the United States legislation and the Canadian legislation. But in both these cases, their starting point has been major incidences of abuse of lobbying. That's where they've started from. America, the classic example, where it's an art form, and a huge amount of money spent on that. Canada, to some extent, similar. A lot of money goes into lobbying there. Westminster has now created the Transparency Act. It's limited to business, the business of commercial lobbying, again reacting to well-known examples of abuse of power. It only relates to the lobbying of ministers and to permanent secretaries. Doesn't relate to MPs, just relates to ministers and permanent secretaries. Well, how many lobbyists go direct to permanent secretary? How effective is that? Is that going to be? It's a reaction to a problem. You look then at Wales, which is similar to us, has next to no record of abuse of the lobbying system. They've looked at it again. They've come up broadly, I'm paraphrasing what they've said, they've broadly said, we don't have a problem. We are determined to make sure that people do not lose their lobbying rights in this democratic institution of ours. And we don't want to make it difficult for the smaller groups like charities community groups, advocacy groups. And with that in mind, they have suggested looking at existing codes within their jurisdiction, and they're looking to see how these can be improved to bring about a tightening of provision there.
Richard?
You've actually answered, Mr Allen, most of the question I was going to ask, but there is one that I've just thought of. I attend my party conference. There are over 100 organisations there with stalls. And they're lobbying a political party. They've all paid to be there. So I stop at every stall. Does that mean I have to record that I've spoken to these people on over those 3 days or 4 days?
Well, I would perhaps come back to the point I made about you might want to look at the Code of Conduct again. The Code of Conduct at the moment says that you should consider keeping a record of contacts with lobbyists. I've suggested, on the one hand, you take out consider, make that a requirement to keep records, but you should add the proviso, contacts with lobbyists where representations are being made. So in that case, if someone takes you aside and talks to you for an hour about a current issue, then that would fall within that category.
The point I made earlier, as I say, we do keep a diary.
Yes.
And our staff keeps a diary for us, and I could publish an issue any time. And as I say, any time I went to a party conference, there have been people who have asked, can I meet you at 12 o'clock at the coffee room to discuss whatever, and that's down, and generally half the time you're running late. Would that then come into an FOI situation?
Oh, I think one of the difficulties you've got about recording people that you've spoken to is the other person content with that being on a public register. And I think that is a big issue. You've got data, not only have you got FOI, you've got data protection issues. Do you put their name and their address down, what they're talking about? Do you have to get their consent to putting it in your diary? Really.
And I know I won't, this will be my last chance to ask you a question. And, it has been, can I say it, having met you before, it has been, I pay tribute to the work that you've carried out in the Standards Commission over the year, and I know the Standards Commission very well, from, as I said previously, from being a councillor, reported 4 times but found not guilty over those years.
Can't beat it.
Thank you very much. Can you just repeat what I believe that you have said consistently throughout? You don't favour this bill at all. You don't see any need for this bill at all.
Well, my starting point is that lobbying is a legitimate part of the democratic process. Anything that interferes with that, you've got to consider with great care. I would be very reluctant as a parliament to go down any route that inhibits someone from making representations to their elected members.
Thank you, Richard. I'll maybe ask the clerks at an appropriate point to just make sure we understand the impact of FOI on MSP's activities, because I think I have a different view from the one I heard you express. And broadly, it does not capture our diaries. Data protection is another issue, where the data subject would be entitled to see what we hold, but not necessarily anyone else. And perhaps we might just make sure that we have a proper view of these matters. Right, I think that brings us to the end of the questions that we were wishing to ask Mr Allen, as you're combining. Let me invite you to give perhaps valedictory remarks in terms of your office, since you'll be leaving it soon, and may not be there to pursue it, but more to the point, if there's anything you think we haven't covered in our discussions today, perhaps you could draw our attentions to it, matters we might wish to think about later.
Thank you, Convener. The issues that I did want to raise were, first of all, whether in fact there was another way of looking at it, perhaps by tightening up the code, the ministerial code, the civil service code. But I've had the opportunity to raise those matters in answer to earlier questions, and I think I've set out, hopefully reasonably clearly, how, if it is, notwithstanding what I've said, decided to go down the registration route, how you've got to design up, whether it's high regulation, medium regulation, low regulation, and I think that's that stage. I do feel that if there were any question of going down any form of regulation, that it should be properly costed and that there should be a business impact assessment made of what that would have on business. I am not a person that says, well, just make this regulation. You'll be able to do it within your own resources. I've seen it all before. And it takes up somebody's time, becomes there is a cost. There's a cost to all these things. So, and generally, otherwise, Convener, I think I did make some valedictory remarks at a previous meeting, not expecting to be back in front of the committee quite so soon. But thank you very much for your kind remarks. It's very much appreciated. I'd just like to say to all the members and the clerks how much I've appreciated the unfailing courtesy I've had at all times. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Allen. All the very best for the next stage in your life.
Thank you.
We now move into private session.